Hi everyone. How very punctual. It's 15 past. My name is Benjamin Becker. I'm the managing director of Amerika-Haus-Direktor Rhine-Westphalia, a transatlantic NGO in Germany's largest state of North Rhine-Westphalia. With me on this call is Ron Nehring, the director of international programs of the conservative training-based think tank Leadership Institute. I will introduce him in a minute. Hi, Ron. Despite these challenging times, I'm excited to welcome you all to another edition of Transatlantic Voices, Stimmen aus Amerika in Zeiten von Corona. In this series, we interview experts from the US from various backgrounds and regions and on various topics. Today's speaker, Ron Nehring, will take us on a tour right across the United States. He works for the Leadership Institute in Arlington, Virginia. He was the spokesperson for the presidential campaign of Senator Ted Cruz of Texas. And before, he was a chairman of the Republican Party in California and the party's nominee for Lieutenant Governor of California. And he was born and raised in New York. Now, before we start, a few words on today's proceedings. One will start with an introductory statement with insights from within the US presidential election during COVID-19. I will then ask him a few questions before I hand it over to all of you. For those of you who are joining via video, you will have two ways to participate. Number one, if you want to ask a question, you can raise your hand virtually. You can click down here. Somewhere there should be a button. It's the raise your hand button. And we can see that if you raise your hands. And when you ask a question, we will unmute you. We will call on you and kindly ask you to please briefly introduce yourself. If you want to send us a question in writing, please click on the Q&A button also down there somewhere. In the German Zoom version, it's called F und A, so for Fragen und Antworten, and then type your question. We can see that you've typed the questions. We can sort them and then read them out for our guest. You can also ask your questions in German, weil Ron hervorragend Deutsch spricht, auch aus familiären Gründen. And we can also translate back and forth, so languages shouldn't be a problem. If you are joining via phone, which some people are, unfortunately, there's no way to ask a question, but you can still listen in. Please note, this call is on the record, so that means that it will be recorded and maybe published. So, on Ron Nehring. He is a strategist and communications expert who served as national spokesman in the 2016 presidential campaign of Senator Ted Cruz. Today, he is the director of international programs for the Leadership Institute. In this role, he conducts programs around the world educating center-right candidates, elected officials, activists, and leaders in campaign strategy, communications, and fundraising. He has addressed over 100 programs, that's pretty impressive, and events around the world, and just in the last 2 years. So he's pretty much, or has been until before this crisis, always on the road. Prior to stepping onto the national stage in 2016, Ron was elected the Republican nominee for Lieutenant Governor of California in 2014. As a communicator and as the Republican Party chairman in California, he has made the advancement of the principles of effective and limited government, so small government as a principle, of individual liberty and freedom his life's work. His mission has led him all around the world to countless countries, including Germany. Last year, during his visit to the Rhineland, and he told me that he's come to Germany for pretty much, I think, every year over the last 30 years. And during his last visit, we had the privilege of hosting a lunch discussion with him, together with the Konrad Adenauer Foundation. We are very thankful that Ron has agreed to share his insights today on this call. We very much look forward to seeing him again in person once this is possible again. And I'm now very happy to turn it over to Ron Nehring.
Danke. Guten Morgen aus California. Es ist jetzt Viertel nach 9 here, and I'm delighted to join so many of our great friends with Amerika-Haus in North Rhine-Westphalia. It really has been a terrific partnership and relationship, and Amerika-Haus is doing vital work on the transatlantic relationship, and I'm really delighted. I was really delighted to meet with you last year and to learn of all the great work that's being done in keeping that transatlantic relationship going. And it's really my honor to have the opportunity to share with you a little bit of insight today on what is happening in American politics. I try to follow German politics as well as possible. I even brought out my Konrad Adenauer kind of experiment mug that I got on my visit last year. So we're in very, very interesting times. Let me give you a little bit of background on where we were at the time that the current situation arose. There was no question that President Trump was going to be the Republican nominee for president going into our November election. The Democratic side had a very, very tumultuous and somewhat chaotic nomination process, with Joe Biden eventually emerging as the Democratic nominee. Bernie Sanders, who is a socialist who runs as a Democrat, was the last remaining Democratic challenger to him. I would say that there was a lot of talk that the Democrats were somewhat disjointed, that it took them a long time to figure out who their nominee was. The primary contest was very vicious and so on, but we always hear that talk. In 2016, when I worked for Senator Cruz, who was the last challenger to President Trump until our campaign ended on May 3rd, that was a very, very vicious primary campaign, but the party ultimately came together behind behind Donald Trump, who then became president. And likewise, the Democratic Party is coming together behind Joe Biden. So I put a couple of slides together, and I'm going to show you a couple of commercials to really illustrate what's happening in the American campaign. First, let me just start by saying that the Leadership Institute, which is the organization I work for, is a nonprofit, nonpartisan organization. We don't normally talk about present campaigns because we don't want to be in a position where people argue, oh, you're advocating for one side or the other. But it's not possible to not talk about current candidates and campaigns on this topic. So nothing that I'm going to present on should be interpreted as endorsing, supporting, or opposing any candidate for office currently. Now, that having been said, the entire campaign for president and every other office that will be voted upon, the campaigns themselves have been thrown into some degree of disarray and have been disrupted by the pandemic. So not only will we elect a president in November, we will elect 435 members of the House of Representatives and 1/3 of the Senate. Those are just the federal offices. In addition to that, we have more than 20 governor's offices that will be up and thousands of local offices, state legislatures, local offices, and the like. So there are thousands upon thousands of campaigns that are being waged currently, and they have all been thrown into some degree of disarray, both functionally and in terms of their messaging by the current pandemic. This is not a surprise, but it is unprecedented in modern times. I've been involved in American politics for 30 years and have never seen anything so disruptive to a political campaign and to a political season than what we have seen right now. So I'm going to walk through what some of the impact has been, and then I'm going to walk through what some of the response has been. I think the most notable element of this from a communication standpoint is the virus is the issue. The number one issue on the federal level and the number one issue at the state level and local level all throughout is the pandemic itself and the response to the pandemic. And this affects candidates for president, Congress, and local offices as well, since like in Germany, many of the decisions concerning the response to the pandemic does not happen on the federal level, but it happens on the state level and the local level. So for example, yesterday in the city of Los Angeles, now Los Angeles is home to 9 million people, the county of Los Angeles, the Landkreis of Los Angeles is home to 9 million people. That's about the same number of people as we have in the entire state of Michigan. And they just announced that they intend to keep their stay-at-home order in effect through August. So that is another 3 months affecting 9 million people. That's very substantial. But that's a decision that's being made on the local level. So there are state politicians, local politicians, federal politicians who all have to deal with this, both in terms of the pandemic response pandemic itself and the response. And the response itself, of course, has a major economic impact. And so this, as it relates to the presidential campaign, has completely thrown the presidential campaign into new territory. President Trump had the good fortune of having a comparatively strong economy for the last 3 years. It was the centerpiece, or to be the centerpiece, of his reelection campaign. They had done a big tax cut. They had planned to do more of that. And the president was his strongest issue was the strength of the economy. Well, that has been completely eviscerated as we have unemployment approaching 20%, which is a higher level than we've seen at any time since the Great Depression. And so the president can no longer run on his strongest message. We see him pivoting to, well, now we've built the world's strongest economy and we'll do it again. That's a bit of what the pivot that's been happening. And we'll see if that works, because unlike the times of kind of experimenting, the adaptation to the current situation really is a big experiment, because nobody has experience on a political level, either as a candidate or a campaign manager or a party leader. No one has experience in doing this kind of a pivot so close to an election. So I prepared for you to illustrate how the messaging has changed. I'm going to show you two television commercials, two commercials. They're both digital, meaning that typically a television ad runs 30 or 60 seconds. These run longer because in a digital format they tend to do that. The first spot is one from President Trump's campaign, and the second spot will be one from former Vice President Biden's campaign. And this is going to give you a little bit of a flavor of what each campaign is talking about. So first, let me show you the video from President Trump's campaign. Here we go.
I'm Donald Trump, and I approve this message. My administration will take all necessary steps to safeguard our citizens from this threat. Hysterical xenophobia gives Americans a false sense. Is it accurate that if these steps had not been put in place, there could have been 2 billion people dead here in the United States? Yes. No matter how hard they try to stop us, they can't. We built the greatest economy the world has ever seen, and we're going to do it again. Together, we're beating back the physical enemy. What the federal government did was a phenomenal accomplishment. Through all, the world has witnessed the unyielding resolve of our incredible American people. Promise made, promise kept. And I'm fighting for you, and I love doing it with everything that I have. And you know that. With the grace of God, we will win this war, and we will win this war quickly. And we will make America great again.
So there you can see the pivot. Number one, that spot is all about the response to the pandemic, and you see the pivot on the messaging from purely "we have a great economy" to "we will do it again." Now let's take a look at what Vice President Biden's campaign has to say. This is a digital spot that they released this week, so it's very, very current, and you can see where they're going with their messaging on it.
Early January, Donald Trump is first warned of the virus. He ignores it.
We have it totally under control. It's going to be just fine.
Defends the Chinese government instead. January 30th, Trump's own cabinet secretary warns of a pandemic, raising concerns that the Chinese government isn't being transparent. Trump calls him an alarmist.
We think we have it very well under control. We're working very closely with China and other countries, and we think it's going to have a very good ending for us.
The next day, the Dow plummets 600 points. Desperate to protect the stock market from sliding further, Trump continues to deny the threat and praise the Chinese government.
We're doing great in our country. China is looking at President Xi, and they're working very, very hard, and I think it's going to all work out fine. Looks like by April, in theory, when it gets a little warmer, miraculously goes away.
But global cases more than double, spreading to over 24 countries. February 25th, one of the CDC's top experts, Nancy Essendon, speaks out, warning it could soon become a full-scale pandemic.
disruption to everyday life may be severe. And I told my children that while I didn't think that they were at risk right now, we as a family need to be preparing for significant disruption of our lives.
Mr. Trump was, quote, furious as he watched the stock market crash after her comments. Trump didn't want to upset the markets. So for the last 5 days of February, the Trump administration took to the airwaves to deny the truth.
We have contained this. I won't say airtight, but pretty close to airtight.
Thanks to the president and this team's aggressive containment efforts, this disease, as Dr. Shukin said, is contained.
February 27th, the market sees through the denials. The Dow continues to plunge, but Trump keeps up the false message.
It will go away, just stay calm, it will go away. I think we'll be doing very well.
April turns into May. The virus doesn't disappear. There is no miracle. The cases mount. The death toll grows. More than 33 million Americans lose their jobs to the pandemic. Unemployment reaches Great Depression era levels. Donald Trump doesn't understand. We have an economic crisis because we have a public health crisis. And we have a public health crisis because he refused to act. Donald Trump didn't build a great economy. His failure to lead destroyed one.
So there you can see where each campaign is going. You'll notice that in the second spot, the Biden spot, you didn't see Joe Biden there at all. And this reflects the fact that any re-election campaign is typically a referendum on the incumbent. If the incumbent is doing a good job, then the incumbent gets another term, and it doesn't matter who the opposition is. If the incumbent is not doing a good job, then the challenger has a better chance here. And so Joe Biden and his campaign, the campaign has been very aggressive in terms of framing the issues, while Biden himself is just staying in his house, and you don't even see him in the spot. So again, each campaign adapting as they feel is best going to serve them. In terms of changing how the campaign works, President Trump very much likes and his favorite way of campaigning are these large rallies. And I must say that there's been no American politician in modern times who's generated the size of the audiences that we have seen at these presidential rallies. I attended one when President Trump came in. I served on Senator Cruz's re-election campaign to the Senate in 2018. And in Dallas, we had a rally that the president put on to support Senator Cruz. And this was held in a stadium in the middle of Dallas, and it was packed. I mean, no American politician who I have seen has been able to generate that type of intensity that you need in order to fill a stadium. I've been to German campaign events as well, which tend to be smaller, nothing on this type of scale. It takes a certain type of candidate to generate the intensity of support that's needed to get people to actually leave their house and go wait in line and go to a rally and be there for basically all day. It takes all day to go to one of these things. All of that is gone. There are no rallies at all, and this not only impacts the president's garnering of earned media, but there are also secondary effects, because what the campaign would do is they would gather data on all of the attendees who come. I mean, you're filling a stadium, with 30,000 people. You're going to know their name. You're going to have their email address. You're going to know information about them, and it was a very useful generator of information for the campaign, as well as volunteers and so on. And I include on the lower portion of this slide that they would broadcast on YouTube these events as well through the president's own website and so on, and gather information, ask people to sign up through there. So it's not only the 30,000 people who would attend the event, but it's also the wider audience and those people who tune in through the web that serves as a mechanism of generating more names and more contacts for the campaign. So all of that is gone. On a more local level, all door-to-door campaigning has stopped. Now, we don't have GDPR or the same type of data regulations in the United States as you have in Germany and in Europe. And so door-to-door campaigning for us is very, very precise. We will have people work through an app on their phone that will provide a map of their community, which doors to go to, what issues to talk to people about. All of that has shut down. There's none of that going on anymore. Most local campaign offices are useless because campaign offices are places to, campaign offices in America are mainly about the volunteers. It's not about the staff. It's about the volunteers, providing a place where volunteers can come and congregate and put mail together and make phone calls together. And then there's that peer pressure on one another to make that additional phone call and so on and so forth. It's really a volunteer nexus at campaign offices. And all of that is shut down as well. So very, very disruptive. So today's situation is that voter attention is on the pandemic and the economic consequences of the pandemic. Social distancing and other rules make traditional campaign techniques impossible. Challenger candidates, meaning candidates who are not currently in office, are having a much harder time getting their message across, because if you're in office, you have a reason to talk to the media every day about the pandemic and the response to the pandemic. But if you're not currently in office, if you're some businessman who's just running for office, you have a very difficult time breaking through. And I think you've seen that phenomenon in Germany as well, in that you have people running for CDU party leader who may not currently hold a government office, who have a harder time getting their message across. Whereas if you're Angela Merkel, or if you're Marcus Söder, or if you're some minister president in some other state, you have a much easier reason to be in the media every day. And then finally, the clock is ticking. The November election is coming. The U.S. Constitution is very clear on when the election is. The election is the first Tuesday after the first Monday in November. There is no provision for moving it, delaying it. None of that will happen. Even during the Civil War, the 1864 presidential election, which happened during the Civil War, happened exactly on schedule. So that election is happening. It cannot be postponed. So how are campaigns adapting to the pandemic? And I'll run through a couple slides, and then I'm happy to throw it open for question. First is, we have state parties all around the country as well. We were supposed to have a California Republican Party convention this month in Los Angeles. That is not taking place at all. It will not even happen virtually. We have to elect two-party officers, and that's being done by mail. The Arizona Republican Party, Arizona being a neighboring state, they moved their May 9th convention to be completely online, to be completely digital. So that type of adaptation is happening. And it allows certain party business to happen, but of course it's not nearly as effective as getting several thousand people in a room where there's networking, briefings, other educational opportunities, etc. So these are substitutes, but I think they're poor substitutes. And it's not something that you'll see us transition to after the pandemic is over. I fully expect that we will go back to traditional campaigning and the like, because it is more effective to be in the presence of people than just to do everything through a little computer screen. So number one, major events are either being canceled or they're moving online. We see local campaigns have to adapt as well. So we find that campaigns are doing online meetings, online meetups, etc., and trying to adapt as best they possibly can. Of course, when you're doing things online, you don't have that same type of camaraderie, and you don't have the same level of peer pressure being exerted for people to walk that extra block or go to that extra precinct, etc. So you find these adaptations are happening, and a lot of innovation having to happen in a very, very compressed period of time. So that's a change that's happening. We have found that the president is doing, since we're talking about the presidential election, he's personally attending and briefing at these daily press briefings on the pandemic. He took a 2-week break after one of them went unexpectedly, and now he's doing them again. And I think these are something of a substitute for the rallies. The president enjoys doing them because he's able to reach a large number of people directly. And this is really one of the core techniques of President Trump, is that he doesn't want to go through the media filter. He wants to be able to talk to people directly. So if he appears at one of these news conferences, it's going to get covered. It's going to be beamed into, hundreds, millions of in homes across the country. And so these are something of a substitute, but they're a poor substitute because they don't generate all of the other types of data that the rallies would generate. Candidates are having to do meetings and interviews virtually as opposed to in person. When here's Senator Cruz, who's not up for election this time, but doing an event from his home. These are substitutes, but they're not the greatest substitutes because you don't get that same level of interaction. Typically, when a candidate would go to a local event of the Chamber of Commerce or the Realtors, etc., they bring staff, they bring literature, they get lists of people who are attending, people sign up, other events are arranged, and all of that really doesn't happen. So these are substitutes, but not ideal substitutes. We have other candidates. Here's an example, who were pivoting to doing charity-related activity as a means of keeping the campaign going during a time when the only thing on people's minds is the pandemic and the response to it. So here's an example of that. And then last two slides, we have states that are shifting how they will vote. So California, it's very easy to vote by mail. But in this coming election, the state will mail a ballot to every voter in the state, regardless of whether they have chosen to vote by mail or vote in person. And so this changes the dynamic for when people will vote. So let's say you have a state with very little vote by mail traditionally. New York, for example, is very little vote by mail. Most people vote in person, which means in a state like New York, you have election day. There's one day where the campaign culminates on that day. In California, because so many people vote by mail, more than half of people in the past have voted by mail and now will all vote by mail. You don't have election day, you have election month, because the ballots go out approximately 4 weeks before election day. And so many people will open that ballot and cast the vote right then and there. Well, that means that if you spend money to communicate with that voter, that money is lost because the voter's already cast that ballot. So on a tactical level, campaigns will really have to retool. And then finally, as more and more conversation goes online, we have to be aware that the Chinese, the Russians, Iran, and other countries are engaging in disinformation and information warfare on a variety of different levels. We just did a very comprehensive webinar at the Leadership Institute that I put together because I spent a month researching the disinformation that China, Russia, and other countries are putting out. And the concern is that as the amount of in-person campaigning declines and people become more dependent on what they get online, including through social media, there is more opportunity for bad information, disinformation, misinformation to kind of pollute the information stream and affect how people make decisions. So that's my quick summary of what's happening here in the U.S. Becker, I'm happy to turn it back over to you, Dr. Becker, and happy to take any questions or elaborate further on any points that you have. And thanks again for the opportunity to share some information with all of you today.
Thanks a lot to Ron Nehring, and now so how do we do this technically now? I have to pull up my, this is live now. Yeah, thanks a lot for your statement. I of course have prepared some questions, but I'm always eager to and always interested in including audience participation. So if anyone, I can just repeat myself for those of you who haven't joined from the beginning. If you want to raise a question, just click on the raise your hand button down there, or click on your Q&A or F&A in the German version button, and we can adapt to that. Is it possible to pull up the two speaker screens again and get rid of the yes, that's easier. Okay, so I'm going to start with some questions. Let's start with some general questions. You run work for the Leadership Institute, and you gave us some intro in the beginning. Now, apart from the presidential campaign, of course, all of our work is affected directly, and both thematically and practically. I mean, you personally, you've always been on the road. You train people, you talk to people, you do events in person, and I can just assume they're more effective if you really, really talk to people. How do you work at the moment? Have you switched to doing trainings online for political mandate holders or applicants? That's the one part of the question. And on an organizational scale, because you want to train the next generation of conservative politicians and influencers and networkers. I mean, networking requires presence in the traditional sense. How do you reach out to your prospective candidates if this continues for a couple of weeks? Also including reaching out to college campuses, which is important for you, as I've learned. So how do you operate at the beginning, at the moment?
So we had begun investing in online training capability even before the pandemic, simply because that's where there's some people who you can reach that way and you can't reach them in person. And so what we did is we pivoted 100% very quickly. All of our in-person events were canceled or moved online. As for me personally, I normally am on the road 75% of the year. And now I have not left Southern California since the middle of March, and I have no plans to leave Southern California until August. So, for me, it's been disruptive in that regard, but I will do 3 different programs by Zoom through this mechanism today alone. So I will be in this chair with my kind of experimenter coffee mug, usually full, throughout most of the day today. And the same is true of my colleagues. So we have multiple programs running concurrently on some days. So for example, I'm with you right now. We have a future candidate school happening through the Leadership Institute directly right now. And any of you who are participating in this are welcome to, if there are any training programs that we offer that you're interested in, you can sign up. Many of them are free. And you can go to leadershipinstitute.org and just go to our website, click on training, and the menu will pop up and you can attend and participate. The time may not be the most convenient if you're in Germany, but if you're interested in being up late and perhaps learning some additional skills, then they're entirely welcome. You're entirely welcome. And we do these training programs for people around the world as well. So to further answer your question, some of our international partners, so for example, in Australia, we work with the Liberal Party, and we will do a series of webinars for them on particular topics next month and the month thereafter. And I will be doing them here at 7:30 at night, adapting to what time it is in Perth in Western Australia. So all of that has gone online. In terms of college campuses, that's a little tougher. Because we will actually send people to organize conservative clubs on college campuses. And since people are not going to campuses, then you don't have that opportunity. So that has been more drastically affected at the moment. But we will go back to that. What will not happen is we will not shift permanently online, because as you noted, there are so many different additional benefits from doing programs in person. That will continue, and that will continue to be the thrust of our programs afterward.
Yeah, I think that's something that we are all experiencing. All of these similar think tank-like organizations. The virtuality is nice, and I think some of it will stay, but it can't be a complete substitute. I have another question that ties in with an audience question that was just submitted. My question is on the federal structure of the U.S. And also of Germany, and that question that I'm gonna quote in a minute ties into that. I mean, just as in Germany that unites our two countries, the U.S. has a federal system, and you have the 50 governors and local authorities and municipalities and so on. I mean, it's a very hierarchical and decentralized. So do you think that's in such a pandemic, in such a crisis of such a major scale, do you think that's actually a disadvantage or an advantage? And go ahead.
So it can work both ways. The advantage is that by having some level of autonomy on a state level, you are going to get variation, and you're going to have experiments, and you're going to be able to look at one another and see what works and what doesn't work. Whereas if you had a one-size-fits-all, we will all do it this way, That's great when it's the right decision, but when it's the wrong decision, everyone goes over the cliff together. So just like in Europe, there has been a nation by nation level response. For example, Sweden and the UK have taken different approaches. Sweden and Germany have taken different approaches, and we can see what the effect is, and then we can learn and adapt. So that is one thing that we have seen play out in this. And we're also comparing data on outbreaks from one state to another. States are opening at different times and in different ways. Sometimes wisely, perhaps sometimes in response to pressure. But regardless of what the motive is, we're going to be able to see the result and adapt accordingly. And so that is a strength. In general, I would say on the federal question I think that countries with a federal system wind up having fewer separatist problems than countries that do not have a federal system. So for example, in the UK, you do not have a federal system. And there is constant tension, with Scotland and so on, because you don't have that clearly delineated set of powers and so on and so forth. Whereas in Germany,
That's right.
and in the US, you don't have that same type of tension because there is an escape valve. And that is there is that degree of local autonomy. So in general, I think there's a real great wisdom in a federal system. Of course, that is strained at a time of great crisis, war, pandemic, so on and so forth. And so this requires political people, elected officials, to get together, regardless of their political differences, and work together. And by and large, you've seen that happen. There have, of course, been problems, and there will continue to be problems. So that's how I think that's played out.
Yeah, I'm going to follow up on that in a minute, but want to include Jan-Christoph Pelz's question, who asked that about the regulations on voting by mail. Does each state have its own rules and regulations there? Is that a federal thing as well? Thanks for your question, Jan-Christoph.
Yeah, this is why it's very difficult to hack a U.S. election, because every state controls how the rules are in that state concerning voting. Now, there are some national standards, of course, right? So men and women can vote, people can vote regardless of race, and so on. There are some national rules there. But whether a state allows voting by mail, or how, or how many polling places they will have, or where they will be placed, or when early voting can start, those are all state decisions. Every state there is no national database of voters. There is no single one database which has every voter in America in it. California has a list, New York has a list, so on and so forth. They all have their own voting systems. They all work differently. So in a state like California, our state had decided for some time to make it very easy for people to vote by mail. Mm-hmm. And so that system, because it's so entrenched already, is relatively easy to scale up to send a ballot to everybody, as opposed to sending the ballot to half of the people. In New York, I think it will be a bigger deal, because New York has traditionally discouraged voting by mail unless you had a good reason, and I think that system will be harder to scale up. So this is something which local and state officials will have to work on a great deal, from now through the election. My concern is that of outside actors, and we saw, for example, in 2016, the Russians hacked into the election systems of more than 20 states. This didn't mean they did anything with it, but they wanted to see if they could. And their objective very often, the Russians, is to generate confusion. So what happens, for example, in a close presidential election where a couple of key states are unable to compile their election results in a timely manner? What type of confusion does that create? The Russian government under Vladimir Putin wants to generate chaos in as many places in the West as possible, and they have certainly been seizing upon this pandemic as an opportunity to do that. So my concern is outside actors, having a negative impact, as well as making sure that states that want to move to all vote by mail are able to do so.
Okay, thank you very much. I would like to come back to the public response that you said. You mentioned a minute ago that in a federal system, the tendency to rebel maybe in a certain sense, also to segment oneself, is maybe lower. But then again, I mean, there is public response to these restrictions at the moment. We see these in both countries. There has been a public outcry or growing outcry in Germany, and also as witnessed in the US, especially in California, in your state where you are at the moment. It seems to me that the restrictions by Governor Newsom are a bit more strict, and the public reacts to that, and the public, in my mind, is highly divided on that matter. How do you see that? I mean, how do you see the mood at the moment, and the question of, on the one hand, protests against restrictions, on the other hand, the call of people for the government to be active and to support them?
Yeah, so there's this is obviously a very, very complicated set of issues. There is a difference between what we see in terms of protesters versus what public opinion is. The overwhelming majority of Americans want the rules to remain in place as long as necessary in order to contain the spread of the virus. That is not what generates the news coverage. The news coverage is generated when some small number of people go down and do a protest, and the news media needs something to cover because they only want to cover things related to the virus. This is related to the virus, and it makes for good pictures and so on and so forth. That does not, that should not underestimate the economic impact. And where we see the greatest amount of tension occur is when we have government rules that are dumb. For example, in the early days, there was a division was created between essential and non-essential businesses. If you were essential, you could remain open. If you were non-essential, you could not remain open. That made sense at first when you're throwing a circuit breaker to stop the spread. But when you're now 8 weeks in and you're looking at 20% unemployment and depression level contraction in the economy, people then think, well, are there ways to do certain jobs to mitigate the risk, even if the government says that that job is, quote, non-essential? And that's what we're seeing movement toward. But that movement may not be moving fast enough, in that there was a very high-profile example in Texas recently of a woman who opened her beauty salon in defiance of a local order and who was sent to jail. And this produced an outcry because it was seen as excessive measures by government to enforce this. Now, so to chart a pathway forward, what we need to do is take those jobs which can be done safely, the landscaper, the window installer, et cetera, where there's a minimal risk, not necessarily zero risk, because everything in life involves risk, but can be done with minimal risk to get people back to work. And so when government is seen as not exercising some degree of common sense, then I think the backlash grows from just a couple of people to wider opinion. Final point is that older people, who are the most susceptible to being killed by this pathogen, are the most interested in saying we should not rush beyond what the medical professionals say. And so the danger is, if you just listen to the protesters and not to the voters, then you could wind up in a position where we open too quickly or in the wrong way, and produce more problems and a second wave and those other issues which we're all familiar with.
Yeah, thank you very much. That ties into a question by Dr. Philipp Adolf from the University of Bonn. He raised his hand virtually, then put it down, then typed it, and I know him, and I don't want to read it out. Philipp, is it okay if we just throw you in the discussion and you ask your question yourself? So I think we'll now give you the mic. And can you still, I introduced you, but please introduce yourself, what you do at the University of Bonn, just one sentence.
Yes, hi, thank you. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah, I'm a lecturer at Bonn University. Thank you very much for your talk. It was quite interesting. Yeah, my question sort of ties in with what you mentioned. I mean, I've recently seen some polling data which illustrates that older voters in particular are souring on President Trump's response to the COVID-19 crisis. So I was wondering, Trump appears to be in a sort of catch-22 situation where he feels he needs to reopen the economy in order to be reelected, but at the same time, of course, he needs older voters to win re-election. So, I mean, this is more of a sort of general question regarding strategy, perhaps. Do you think that perhaps it might be sensible for the president to chart a more cautious course on the economy in order to keep older voters in his camp? Particularly because I think we've seen that voters don't really blame President Trump for the state of the economy because they can see that this is largely due to the virus. So I was just wondering what would be your take on this?
Thanks a lot, Philip.
Yeah, that's certainly a great question, and you picked up on a couple of things. You'll notice that the Biden spot really tried to do as much as possible to completely blame the state of the economy on the president's response. And some people are going to go along with that, but many other people will say, due to the nature of the pandemic, some of this was inevitable and is not the president's, personal fault. I think that due to the tendency of this virus to spread, meaning its natural R rate in the wild, meaning if no mitigation measures are taken, that it's not a question of when you open the economy, but it's how you open the economy. And I would really focus on that. I've been very impressed with the communication strategy of Prime Minister Boris Johnson, for example. I think he's done a very good job kind of laying it out. You have to show what the pathway forward is. You have to keep the focus on where it needs to be and show that there's progress. I think that on the U.S. side, that would be, my advice, and that is to keep it tight, keep it succinct, show a pathway forward, show that there's a process. But on a mechanical level, there is a health cost to being in a depression. If the country is thrown into a real depression, the likes of which we've not seen in close to 100 years, people will die as well. Suicide rates are in direct proportion to the unemployment rate. There is a direct correlation there, particularly among people who've been unemployed for a longer period of time and are still of working age but are older. So let's say people in their 40s or 50s. There's a real cost to that as well. There's a cost in terms of if you're in a depression, sooner or later the money's going to dry up. And your roads are not going to get repaired and your hospitals are not going to be funded. I mean, there are real health costs to that as well. And so it's wise to keep our eye on that as well, because you don't want to substitute one disaster for another disaster. That being said, I think there really is a premium on communication and making sure that people understand that we're doing everything we can to protect our seniors, how seniors can protect themselves, what things that people who are not in government can do to protect seniors, but then also show the pathway forward in terms of the economy. I don't think it's an either or. I don't think it's health or the economy. It has to be both, and it's not a matter of when, it's a matter of how. So I think, for example, the Los Angeles extending the stay-at-home order, which is a blanket order for 3 more months, may not be the best policy. I think the better way is to do the harder work. It's harder for government to say we're going to take every occupation and we're going to look at that occupation and say, how can we do that job safely? Window installers, pool repair people, construction, etc. How can that job be done with a minimal risk? And therefore, how can we open the door for those people to get back to work? Much like what was done with Germany and manufacturing, during the, presently. So and knowing government, that's harder to do for government to do. That takes more time. It's very easy to sign a document and say, nobody worked for 3 months. It's much harder to take government agencies and say, we need you to come up with a set of rules for how yogurt shops can open. That takes a lot of work. You got to kind of figure it out. You got to pass a rule and you got to go through the whole process of rulemaking and so on. That's harder. It's understandable that people in government are like, oh, that's a pain in the neck. We're going to do that. Yeah, we have to do that because we have to deal with the fact that there is no vaccine. We are unlikely to get to herd immunity anytime soon. And we cannot shut the world economy down, or at least our economy down, indefinitely.
Good point with the world economy. It's great. I have so many questions prepared, but I don't get to them because we have so many great audience questions. There's one from Jinkai Shi. I hope I pronounced that correctly. I'm going to read it out. They're writing, thank you for sharing your interesting insights. I work as a municipal economic development agency at an agency located in NRW. And due to my Chinese background, I'm pretty much interested in the consequences to the world economy caused by the coronavirus, especially how the political and economic relationship between the US, China, and the EU is going to be after the pandemic. So an international outlook. What's your take on that? Thank you. And thank you, Jinkai.
Well, I think all of these will be affected, but I think, of course, they will all be affected differently. So let's talk about China for a moment here. The perception of China among people in America is way down. And that's in large part because of the Chinese government, which is a Communist Party dictatorship. On the political side, it is a communist dictatorship. On the economic side, right, they've introduced market elements. That's why their economy does relatively well. But the Chinese government has responded the way other non-transparent dictatorships respond, and that is by not being transparent with information. And so for weeks, the Chinese government said that they had no evidence of human-to-human transmission. They told that to the World Health Organization. The World Health Organization took that at face value and told the world, and precious time was lost. The opportunity to contain it was lost, and instead you went to community spread globally. And so I think that the Chinese government's going to pay a price for that, and at a minimum, in terms of how people look toward China. And there are people who are advocates of free trade, for example, who are going to have a harder time making that argument because the stronger argument will be that we cannot put ourselves in a position where we rely on China for anything, whether it's face masks or ventilators or rare earth materials or anything else. So there'll be that element of things. In terms of the relationship with the EU, I don't see a negative consequence, here at all. I think that, the U.S. and EU countries and the UK, which is now kind of in the EU until they're fully out, I think everybody's kind of working together and so on. And we've not had a lot of blame being thrown around there. I think the Russians are using this as an opportunity to pour gasoline on the fire. We have seen in the past the Russians in 1983, the Russians, the Soviet Union began a campaign to blame AIDS on the U.S. Army. In 2009, they attempted to blame the H1N1 flu on the U.S. military. And in 2014, they attempted to blame Ebola on the U.S. military. So it's not surprising that the Russians would continue to put out disinformation, and also using RT and Sputnik and other troll farms and other media outlets to say the EU is collapsing, the EU has failed again, the EU did not come to help Italy, things like that.
And what's being done to prevent that, if I may jump in? That's also what's being done to prevent that? That's also an audience question.
Well, I think the EU has done a very good job in terms of actually setting up a structure with the European External Action Service and their website, EU versus disinfo.eu, great website. And I think the Europeans are doing a better job than our country is in terms of spotlighting disinformation that is coming from Russia, China, and elsewhere. And I think part of it is that you have Russia on your doorstep. You have Russia in Europe. Russia's a little further away in the minds of many Americans, but they're still creating mischief, and more needs to be done on the U.S. side to raise sensitivity of that and not allow the Russians to drive more wedges either within Europe or between Europe and the United States.
Thanks a lot for these insights. Coming back to, we are nearing the end of that discussion, and there's still so much to talk about potentially. Coming back to the election that we are heading towards, which we initially started with. Now, when the California governor Governor Newsom promoted this in-mail ballot voting, President Trump's campaign communicator, communications director Tim Murtaugh has called this, and I quote, a thinly veiled political tactic by the governor to undermine election security. End of quote. Now I get this. This is about election security, but maybe it's also about a strategic issue of who goes to vote, who votes in which way, and if all of this increased until November, and maybe it's not so unlikely that in-mail voting will increase. How does that affect potentially structurally the election, also when it comes to conservative and liberal camps? And if so, why?
So number one, more people will vote by mail in this election, probably in any other election in U.S. history. So regardless of what the name calling that will go back and forth, the reality is that more people will vote by mail, and campaigns need to mechanically adapt to that. It means that you have to be aware of when the ballot is going, when the ballot is landing, when the people are making their decision. And for those voters who have already cast a ballot, you want to stop spending money communicating to a voter who's already voted. Because that's a lot of money that can be wasted talking to people who have already cast their ballot and therefore cannot be affected by that spending. There will be that type of name calling that will go back and forth about voting by mail. I expect that may have some effect on how many states choose to vote by mail or so on. And we also don't know what the situation will be in November. Will people feel that they don't want to wait in line, voting in person? What will public opinion be on that? We don't know. So regardless, campaigns have an imperative to monitor how their states are changing their rules and adapt their campaign accordingly.
Yeah, we'll see. I mean, this is of course, all in the open and hard to predict at this time. Still an estimation. I mean, one fear that many people will have, I have that personally. If the whole system is so eroded and so disrupted, as you call it, and if this continues and let's say the grounding of the election is changed in a structural way, do you fear that however this goes, do you fear that the legitimacy of the election will be questioned?
Well, there is one group of people who have demonstrated that they have an active interest in undermining the legitimacy of Western elections, and that is the Russians. We've not seen that from any other country to that degree, but we know that it has been part of the Russian playbook in the West to undermine the legitimacy not only of elections, but of any Western institutions, whether that's government, health, etc. And you can bet that if there is an opportunity presented to undermine the legitimacy of the U.S. election, the Russians will take advantage of it.
No, I get that. I get the propaganda part. I mean, from within the U.S., if votes get lost, if people do not get to vote at all, if structures change, not talking about disinformation, but really the mood in the country. Do you fear that?
Well, certainly. Any opportunity, anything where people are not able to vote, et cetera, will be hyped in the media and will have a disproportionate effect, even if it doesn't affect the ultimate outcome of the election. So yes, we have confidence in our institutions because they operate in a reasonable way. If they fail, then yes, you could have questions being raised, and that could have an impact. My only point on the Russians is you can bet that they will be trying to light the fire, which then other people may choose to amplify.
As we are nearing the end, any final questions by the audience? Please click on the button down there on the Q&A or on the raise your hand button. I can then pull you in. If not, I'll monitor that closely, and I have two final questions because we talked a lot about the economy, meaning, of course, people being unemployed and so on. But let's talk about another aspect of the economy, that's campaign budgets. Do you think, as a campaign expert, will this election be very, very cheap in campaigning? training styles, or will more money be spent virtually? What's your estimation on the structural budgetary side?
I think that the way campaigns spend money will change because we're not doing the in-person stuff. I would expect that there'll be a tremendous shift toward digital, both in terms of digital advertising and in terms of digital, campaigns beyond the paid advertising. In other words, getting volunteers to be active organically through their own networks of people. I expect that will happen.
Well, that's for free, right? That doesn't cost money.
Well, it does cost money. If you want to do it right, it costs money.
Yeah,
because
if you structure it.
Organizers then talk to people to get things done. And so the goal with anything online is that it's more effective if it's seen as being organic. But there's always more of that happens when there's an organizer who's in touch with you. Would you share this story? Would you pass this on? So on and so forth. So I think that how the spending happens will shift. How much money is available? That's a really good question, because you're not raising money in person the way that you normally would. You're not, Joe Biden is not flying to San Francisco and doing an event with 25 millionaires in the same room. That's not going on. So it'll be interesting to see how much money the campaigns are able to raise under the current conditions.
Final question now, as we are really nearing the end, an outlook to not 2020, but 2024. I mean, you as the Leadership Institute representative, you're training the future of the party, of the Republican Party. Do you see, where do you see the future of that party headed? Are there any unseen stars at the moment that you are currently, maybe you can't talk about them, but do you have anyone inside that you are currently training, or is VP Pence, does he have ambitions for 24, or Senator Cruz? So what's happening after 2020, regardless of the outcome?
So at the Leadership Institute, we train everybody who walks through the door. Many are Republicans, many are not. And so we don't have a horse in that. Certainly there are people who are emerging, who are planning to run for president. I think Nikki Haley, the former South Carolina governor, is planning to run. I would expect Vice President Pence to run. I don't have any inside information, but I'm hopeful that Senator Cruz will run. I think there will be no shortage of people who will run in 2024 on the Republican side. On the Democratic side, that depends on whether, number one, if Joe Biden is elected, and number two, if he chooses to run for 2 terms. I mean, maybe he just runs for 1 term if he's successful. We don't know. But we train people at every level as well. So we have more than 30 graduates who are serving in Congress currently, and governors and state legislatures and things like that. So, we really operate a little bit differently than on the German side. We do not have a Konrad Adenauer Stiftung and a Hans Seidel Stiftung and so on. When it comes to political training, on the right, it's us. On the left, there's a variety of groups on the left that do that too.
Yeah, got it. We are out of time, unfortunately. I would love to continue that, and maybe if the situation stays like that, maybe we'll just have a follow-up, if that's okay with you.
Happy to.
Or at a later point, just meet in person again. Now, this concludes today's edition of Transatlantic Voices, Stimmen aus Amerika in Zeiten von Corona. First of all, thank you very much, Ron, for taking the time, sharing your insights. Always a pleasure. Thank you also to my team, in particular to Katarina, my colleague, who does everything in the background, who pulls up the slides and so on, and who prepared this also conceptually. And thank you everyone out there for your interest and your great questions. We're doing these video calls on a regular basis with expert speakers from the US, from various backgrounds and regions, and some various subtopics. Next week, we will talk more, I guess, about Joe Biden. We'll have a voice from the opposing side of the political spectrum. On Tuesday, May 19th, we'll have Governor Howard Dean, who was a presidential candidate for the Democratic Party in 2004, and he will share his insights also on the election campaign. The invitation will be sent out tomorrow. Let's stay connected in these challenging times and be assured we will be back digitally and, once time allows, also in presence again. Until then, be safe, stay healthy, tschüss and goodbye.